Welcome back again to the Ivory Tower Collections. Today's video is going to focus on the Sega Saturn, a wonderful console that came out in the mid-90s with lots of great games. But it does have one annoying feature that plagues us gamers today who still use it, and that is it relied on a small coin cell battery on the back rear of the console that maintains the internal date and time clock on the console and also maintains the game save files in the memory of the Sega Saturn. So obviously it's a problem if the battery goes bad, because not only do you constantly get greeted with the screen of changing your date and time every time you power it on, but it also means that it erases any save game files that may have been in the console as well. And that's a problem. It's annoying. So how do we get around this? Well, one way was to use something like an action replay cartridge like I have here. I actually used this for many years, in fact, personally, and I still kind of do. It has a lot of different features, but primarily for the cases of this video, I would use it as a backup device for my game saves. So, I'd play a game on the Saturn, and then, when I was done, before I'd power the Saturn off, I would reset it, and I would copy the save game file to the cartridge itself. And then later on, with the cartridge plugged into the Saturn, when I wanted to play the game and continue where I left off, I would simply copy the save game file off the cartridge back into the memory of the Sega Saturn and continue from there. But there is another solution, and that is that you can actually change the memory chip itself that's used in the Sega Saturn to store those save game files with a newer, more modern replacement like I have here in my hands. And that's what we're going to focus on in this video, is changing out the memory chip that stores the save game files with a slightly more modern, non-volatile replacement that doesn't need the battery to maintain that information. So here we are in the action replay. So I'm going to go to the memory manager real quick, and you'll see that the system memory listed here is completely blank. It shows a full 510 out of 510 memory banks. There's nothing there, and again, that's because the battery's bad on this Saturn, so it doesn't keep any of my save files. So what I usually have to do again is I have to pull up, my cartridge memory over here like we see being listed here, and I just have to copy them into the Saturn each time I want to play a particular game. So let's say, as an example, I want to copy over my Radiant Silvergun file here. So I'm going to hit the button to copy that into active memory, and then I'm going to exit out to actually get it written, or just start my game, either way. And here we are in my Ray menu file now. Yes, I do have a Ray installed in this particular Saturn. So, at this point I can go ahead and load up Radiant Silvergun, and we'll see that on the main menu it will allow me to select my previous save game file, because again, I just copied it over to the system. See, there it shows that I have a save start file that I can use. So if I power the Saturn off, take my action replay cartridge out, wait a little while here to let it discharge out any power it might have. Let's take another look here and see. Alright, we'll go here, and like before, I'll skip past the date and time settings. This time I'm just going to go straight into the Saturn's system settings and take a look at the memory management here. Okay, now you'll notice that at this point it doesn't show the availability to do a remove item, and that's because there's nothing here. If I click on clear memory, we can see that there is nothing saved in the system. It just doesn't show anything there. It's empty. So yeah, that's the problem, because again, the battery's out. So we are going to take care of this problem by replacing a memory chip inside the Saturn. Let's talk about what's going to be required to do this. This is not, I guess it's not super difficult to do this mod, but it's definitely not recommended for beginners. You're going to be dealing with some surface mount devices. In this particular case, the main memory chip itself is a surface mount device. So with that said, I can't take any responsibility if you end up hosing up your console as a process of trying to attempt this yourself. So if you do so at your own risk, of course. Let's talk about the tools that we're going to need for today's little project. So first and foremost, as I always have on hand, we need our number 2 Phillips. Gotta have that. It's just a staple with pretty much any of these projects. You just always need to have this on hand. You're also going to need possibly some small needle nose pliers. This is going to be used later on for holding some wire and other stuff in place. You might also, if you don't have a pair, you might get you some electrical tweezers like these, or just some really sharp fine tip tweezers like I use here. You're also going to need, and this is a very critical item, you're going to need some side flush cutters. The sharper, the better. You're going to need to get you some liquid flux, or any flux really that works to your liking. We will also need some alcohol to clean up afterwards, because again, if we're using this flux, obviously we're going to have some residue left over, so always have some alcohol on hand. Get you like an old toothbrush that's going to be used in facilitating and the cleanup of stuff, so we'll need that. Also, wouldn't be a bad idea to have some cotton buds on hand. And let's see, what else? Ah yes, the star of the show. You're going to need this as well. This is the replacement RAM that's going to be necessary for the replacement. So this is the replacement memory module that we will be putting inside the Sega Saturn to remove the old SRAM based flash chip or SRAM chip that was in it to record your game save files. You're not going to be able to find them for too good a reasonable price, at least from what I researched, from your usual places like Mouser and Digi. I ended up getting quite a large bulk of them actually off of eBay, so again, your mileage may vary with that and you have to be careful. But these are the chips you want. These specific ones here are made by the old Ramtron company, and the actual chip type is got a label on it that says it's FM1808, and then this happens to be -70-SG. So the 1808 is really the most critical part of that. There are both S's and SG variants. The SG variant is just a more green version, I guess, of the chip as far as the manufacturing and stuff goes. And that's what I have here, and these work just fine. And the reason why they're so useful is because they're actually an upgrade over the original chips. The original chips relied on the battery, as I stated at the beginning of the video, in order to maintain your save files, whereas this one is non-volatile, so it doesn't require the battery to maintain the data. You'll also need some wire, of course. There is going to be a section where we need to use a little bit of wire. I've got some 28 gauge spool wire here, some small solid core kynar that I use from time to time. So yeah, aside from that, you also need your usual tools, your soldering iron, preferably one with an adjustable temperature, but yeah, that and just a good quality spool of solder as well. Anything else is just whatever tools you think you deem you need to do the work. With that, let's tear down the Saturn and get started. Here I have my Sega Saturn. Now again, I've already removed most of the screws that are on this, but just to give you an idea as to where they're located, and again, this is an early Model 1 unit, you've got one located here, another one up here, over here, back here in the far corner, not sure how well that could be seen, but it's there, and then there's another one over here, just kind of offset center on the rear as well. So there's a total of 5 screws, that hold the back cover, or that hold the two halves together. Now, once you've taken all those screws out, again, this being an earlier Model 1 unit, there we go, it's actually got some wires that are attached to it that I'm going to have to take off. So very carefully here, I'm going to lift up and remove the main power supply plug down here. So with that power supply cable removed, I can now flip the front lid over, and I can remove the other wires that are in my way. I've got the CD lid closed sense tray and LEDs, plus the power indicator LED here, and that takes that off. I'll set that off to the side because I no longer need it. And again, I have array installed in mine. Normally you would have your disk drive unit here, but you have the same basic cables. So I'm going to remove the power cable and lift up. I'm going to use my tweezers for this one. lift up on the catches here for the ribbon cable. I'll see if I can get that, see if you can kind of see that. Located here, you just have to lift up on the edges of it to loosen the lock so that you can then just pull the cable out. CD interface cable like that. And now my ray can come out of here. And yes, this Saturn is old, it's been abused, it's got a lot of rust on the RF shield, but it still works. So from here what we need to do is we need to get the RF shielding off of here. Now I think I've already, since I've been in here once before, I was probably a bad technician and didn't put all the screws back in. It looks like we're missing one right here, but it looks like all the rest of them are in place. Now there's this plastic cover from the power supply. It's really its main job again is just to isolate the power supply from everything else. You'll have to slide that out and take it out of there. So I'm going to set that off to the side. And that's because there is a screw over here that's going to be in the way that you got to get access to. So I'm going to take those out now. And again, these tweezers come in handy for getting some of this stuff out of there. There we go. Now, if I remember correctly, these screws are not all the same size, so you might want to lay them out in a way that makes sense. Yeah, this screw is longer than the other one. So this is one of the screws from the cartridge port area in comparison with the other one I took out, and there's quite a bit of difference. There's, yeah, this one's only about 3/4 the height of the other one from the cartridge port. So when I lay these out, I'm going to do so in a manner that matches up how they were kind of laid out when I took them out of the system. There's another cartridge screw there. So there's two there, one here. There's another one here in this corner. So we'll get that out in the front. That's the same size as the other one, so that can go. And I think there's also normally a screw here as well, but it looks like that is missing on mine. And that looks to be about it. So at this point, I should be able to lift this shield up. Alright, there we go. Get the shielding out of here. Again, we don't need it, it's in the way. And now, at this point, we can access the main guts of the Saturn. Now, this being an older Model 1, the area and the chip that we are concerned with is located right here. And I probably need something better to point with, but that'll work for now. So this is the chip that we're going to be taking out. Again, it's a small surface mount chip, and we're going to be replacing it with this Ramtron version like that. Now, the Ramtron is almost an exact pin-to-pin match. There is one pin that we will need to, I think we'll need to pull it low because it's not used, and it's not good to leave data lines or pins floating on a chip if you don't use them. So we're going to throw, I believe it's pin 22 on the Ramtron. We're going to put it to ground. Now, the cool thing about this is the orientation of how it's going to lay out here. Pin 22 is going to be located somewhere over in this area, and there's a ground point right here where a capacitor, looks like capacitor 38 would have been placed. So that should be fairly easy to just route a small ground wire over to it off the pin once I have everything else soldered in place. Now, you'll also notice that I have already recapped this one as well in the past. Normally these older model Saturns had surface mount capacitors, and I've replaced it with radials. But it works. It does the job. Okay, so I'm also going to have to work over here with my soldering iron. Now I have a little bit of room, but I would feel more comfortable if I also remove this standoff leg for the CD-ROM mechanism. So I'm just going to take that off and set that off over to the side as well. And I'm also going to go ahead and remove the CD interface board. So we're going to take that screw out as well. Now the CD interface board is just kind of pressed fit in there. It's actually on a connector, a very large connector actually, that's going to really be holding on to it. So you got to be careful with it when you weasel it up off of there, just like that. See, you can see a large connector here that it attaches to. So set this off to the side. No longer require that. Okay, so at this point it's going to be the hard part to get in here and remove this old chip. So I'm going to probably change the camera angle, maybe zoom in on this a bit, and go through that process. Okay, I've now changed the camera angle a little bit so that we can see the chip a little bit better here. There we are. Should be centered in your screen, more or less. And again, we're going to have to remove this chip. Now you have to be very, very careful because, number one, it's a surface mount chip and it's got tiny pads along the edges that it's soldered down to. But a lot of Sega Saturns, in addition to it also being small surface mount like this, also have the disadvantage of frequently you will find that this chip, along with the BIOS chip as well on these, actually has epoxy holding it down. So, you know, even if you get all of the solder removed off of these pins, you'll find that actually taking the chip off the board can still be an additional challenge because of the epoxy that's been placed underneath it. I don't know if I'm going to encounter any epoxy on this one. I've been told that you can sometimes look down inside of the chip just before where it meets the board to see if that's the case. I don't know if I can with this one or not. I'll see if I can see it for myself. As best as I can see, it doesn't look like it, but you know, again, we don't really know. So how am I going to get this off of here? Well, the ideal method, which is not something I can do here because I just simply haven't the equipment, is to use a hot air station to constantly circle around the chip over and over and over and over until everything gets loosened up, at which point you can then use the tweezers to just kind of pull it off of there. What I'm going to do is a little bit different. Oh, it's one more tool I forgot to mention. I'm such a bad guy sometimes. You're also going to need some side cutters like these. Very sharp ones. So the method I've done in the past, which seems to work pretty well for me, is to just take my side cutters and just slowly clip each leg one by one about midway across. That way I'm not putting the solder pads at risk, but I have heard that even doing that can still put additional stress on the pins. So I've had some technicians tell me it's a good idea to actually flood the lower portions of these legs with solder just to additionally strengthen them to the board before clipping them. So what we're going to do is I'm going to try and remove just one, just to see how it looks for me. I'm going to turn this a little differently so that we can see it. There we go. When I go to try to remove one of these legs. So I'm just going to clip it right about in the middle. Okay, well, that's actually going to work really well. But again, these are pretty sharp side cutters. So that's of course going to help a lot. Okay, so you can see that the chip is already lifted up pretty good on one side there. Looks like I'm going to have to cut again because it doesn't look like all the pins quite came loose the first time around. There. Chip is removed, and I got lucky on this old Model 1. It does not have the epoxy underneath it. So that takes care of the old chip. And again, the new replacement is almost the exact same size. In fact, it pretty much is the exact same size. But again, it won't just solder straight down. It will, but you know, we need to clean up these pads first. So I still have the remnants of the old legs still on here. So what I'm going to do to get rid of that is just to use my soldering iron on some low heat and just kind of go over this a little bit just to kind of scrape away, it's a horrible word to use, but to just kind of wick off of there the old legs as much as I can. So that'll be the next process. I now have all the old legs removed off the pads. What I'm going to do now is apply a little bit of flux across all these old pads and then use my desoldering braid to clean them up additionally. It's also worth noting that I have my iron temperature set fairly low to prevent possible damage to the pads. I have my iron set at about 325 right now. Now, I will clean those up, get that old flux off of there with some alcohol and a toothbrush. Follow it up with a Q-tip, cotton swab. Just to kind of get any residual flux off of there if it might exist on the board after the toothbrush. Now, you may remember I mentioned that we'll need to end up grounding a small wire to pin 22 off the new replacement chip. Since I have such a convenient point right here to do that, I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit more solder to that pad just to get that ready for me. Just like that. Now, if you want to verify that that is indeed a ground, this is where your meter comes in. Hopefully you have a digital multimeter. Nobody should be doing work like this without a minimum of a digital multimeter with continuity and diode and resistance checks. And let's see, I'm just going to pick a common ground point anywhere on the system. I'm just going to use, there's lots of little ground points all around the board. No problem there. So yes, the negative lead marked on the board is definitely tied to ground. So that's exactly where I need to, or that's a good spot that I can use to attach the wire I need to off of pin 22. The next step is a little trickier at this point. Basically it involves essentially getting this chip lined up where it needs to be. More or less that's where it will go. And then what I'll do is I'll end up tacking down one pin or one leg down, which will still give me a little bit of lateral movement to be able to adjust this up further. Once I think I've got it where I need to, I'll hold it down securely and then I'll solder it down in another location just to secure it more. Once that's been done, I'm going to hit this thing with a lot of flux around the edge of the pins, and then I'm just going to more or less drag solder across to make sure everything is thoroughly connected up and wetted properly with the solder. That's going to be the process I'm going to go through here in just a moment. Before I do that though, I am going to go ahead and lift pin 22 on the chip just so it's up and out of the way, because again I don't need it to be attached. And like a lot of IC chips of this sort, the pins are counted starting with the one with the arrow as pin 1. So you're going to go from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Because it's 14 across, we know that it's a 28 pin chip. So then 15 starts over here where this little dot indicates, so that's going to be 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, and 22. So this is pin 22 right here. So in case you want to, maybe make a little dot or something, I like to use my little Sharpie for this. There's actually a couple of other dots already on the board that are marked, but I'm just going to put a tiny little silver dot right there in front, so that I know where that pin is located. That way I can go ahead and bend it up, flatten it up off the board. Okay, so now what I'll do is I'll get one leg tied down, I'll get this adjusted and get it aligned up where I need to, tie down another leg, and then I'll drag solder across. Now, like before, I'm going to use my toothbrush and some alcohol here. I'm going to go over these pins again to clean the flux residue off. Now, I've got to be careful with that one because remember I do have one pin lifted over here, pin 22. Clean up these pins, clean it up a little bit, get this cotton bud here. Right, now we're ready to get a small piece of wire to attach to it off of pin 22. There we go. Alright, and again, it just needs to attach to this ground wire right here, so I'm just going to kind of see where I need to place it, more or less like that. And I can cut right about there. Alright, that should do it. Okay, and then I will do a real quick continuity check to make sure that pin is grounded where it should be. And all I'm going to do is just find another ground point somewhere on the board and touch the top of the pin. Good. Now in this case I could have just tried checking the ground connection where I soldered it with that small piece of wire, but by checking another ground point somewhere else along the board, I can be sure that that is connected where it is definitely connected to that pad, or else I wouldn't have gotten continuity to another spot on the board like I just did. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get this thing buttoned back up, and we're going to test it and see if it works. All right, let's test it out. So I now have the Saturn reconnected back up, and we're ready to test it and see if this works. So I've got my Action Replay cartridge plugged in. Again, it's asking for the language settings because although this modification is designed to store the game saves in the event of power loss and without the need for the battery, it does not correct the issue that the clock and the internal settings of the Saturn itself will not be retained. So you'll still have to go through setting your language options each time you go through this, as well as the date and time, but it's a minor thing. There's the Action Replay menu. So what we'll do is I'm going to go to the Memory Manager again. I'll move my camera over to zoom in on it a little bit. There we are. And we can see that once again there's nothing in the Saturn's memory. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy over a couple of files. So let's get my Radiant Silvergun file. How about my Burning Rangers file? Maybe my Power Slave file. And let's get this Batsugan file over. That sounds good. And start game. Now I'm not going to actually start a game. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and turn off the Saturn. But before we do that, let's verify that the Saturn does show memory contents now. So here we are. Here are my save files in the Saturn's memory. We can see that. That's confirmed. And now what I'll do is I will go ahead and power off the Saturn completely and remove my Action Replay cartridge out. And we'll wait a little bit here. I'll even pull the power cord. There's the power cord sitting right there. Try and power it on a few times just to make sure we discharge anything as far as the capacitors and the power supply. Alright, let's turn it back on now. And it's asking for the date and time again because, again, that doesn't actually get stored. But if we go back into the Saturn's memory, we should see the save files are still present. The fact that remove item is available is a good sign. That would seem to indicate that there's some files there. And sure enough, my game saves are still there, so no problems. So yeah, successful, awesome. So thanks again for hanging out with me today at the Ivory Tower Collections. Let me know about your projects you've done with your Sega Saturn. I'd be curious to know. And thanks again for watching.